Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And today we're going to be talking fantasy. Specifically, we're going to be talking the top 5 classic fantasy books. These are the foundations of fantasy. Now, we're not going to go any further past the 1970s. That actually seems like it might be a little late, but really, within the last 20, 25 years, fantasy has transformed itself into an incredibly vibrant genre. There's all kinds of fantasy being written now. A lot of diversity in fantasy, and it's really kind of exploded in quality as well as in quantity. So if you're into fantasy, now is a great time to be into fantasy. There was a while where it was slim pickings, but now, if you're a fantasy fan, you've got a lot. But a lot of this modern fantasy, which kind of influences in the last 20, 25 years, all these books have influenced each other, which is one of the reasons you've got such a difference now compared to what fantasy was 25, 30 years ago. There was a time when it was like, it was just, if it wasn't Lord of the Rings-ish, you weren't going to get your fantasy novel published. So, yeah, let's get into it. Now, these books that I'm going to talk about here had a tremendous influence on the modern fantasy, even though it came from a long time ago. So let me dig down here and get number 5. I'll be right back up, guys. Okay, number 5. And I'm going to count this as all one book, so might be stretching it a bit. But number 5, Elric by Michael Moorcock. If you have not read Elric, read Elric. You can't properly be a well-read fantasy fan. You can't. I don't care what else you've read. You can't be a well-read fantasy fan if you haven't read Elric. Tremendously influential character. Michael Moorcock wrote a ton of fantasy and science fiction books, but he is best known for Elric. Elric, doomed Lord Elric in his doomed world with his dark sword Stormbringer, which will suck out your soul. Elric, who is kind of weak in real life and sickly, and he needs drugs to keep him going until at least he got Stormbringer, and then he just sticks you with Stormbringer and sucks out your soul, and that gives him strength. This series is Elric's adventures, and he has some crazy adventures. It has been published in many different ways over the years. He wrote them not in the order of Elric's life, kind of like Conan later on, or Conan earlier, excuse me. He did not write them in chronological order. He jumped around. And so if you have this set, this is the Ballantine Del Rey set. If you have this set, you're going to get to the end of this book and go, okay, there's a second volume? How do you do that? What the hell? Yeah, it's interesting. This is the set I have, the Del Rey set. There is another set that's out now, which I think might actually be... I haven't seen it, but it might be printing his adventures in chronological order. Back in the 70s and 80s, you can get paperbacks that did that. But then they came out with these. And these are actually kind of cool books. The series starts out with, here, the Stealer of Souls. And then we're going to go to rescue Tanalorn. Then we got the Sleeping Sorceress. Look at that. Isn't that cool? Then we got Duke Elric. That's a great cover. There's old Duke Elric there. And in the Dream Realms, yeah, I know, this is a lot of Elric to read. If it's one book, it's a long one. And finally, Swords and Roses with angry Elric there on his spooky horse. the character of Elric and Elric's world, it's sort of unforgettable, and it's certainly had a huge influence since it was all written. So that is number 5. Number 4, the Gormenghast novels. Spooky castle Gormenghast with its spooky, creepy people that live in the castle. The castle's so big, a lot of the spooky, creepy people that live in the castle never leave the castle. They just stay in the castle all the time. And then again, we've got a doomed hero. And it's great. I haven't read this actually since I was maybe 23 or 24, so I really have to pick it up again. There's not a lot of overtly fantastic elements in this book, at least in the first 2 volumes. This is a trilogy, Titus Grown, Gormenghast, and Titus Alone. You can get it all into 1 volume now. Yeah, the first 2 books at least, you don't see a lot of magic, for example. What is fantastic is the setting. It is in a fantasy world. And it has a lot of fascinating characters that live within these pages and in the castle. And yeah, a lot of, when I was reading A Song of Ice and Fire, I only actually read the first 2 books of The Song of Ice and Fire because I was real smart, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to wait till the entire series is done, and then I'll read the whole thing at once. Okay, we know how that worked out. A Song of Ice and Fire, he's never going to finish it. It will never be done. At least not by Martin. He's not going to finish it. This is just a little aside. Just letting you know, in case anybody was still under the illusion that that series was going to be finished. It's not. But when I was reading the first 2 books of that series, I thought a lot about this book. I don't know if he read it. I feel like he must have, because I see a little bit of this in those books. And there are a lot of fantasy books that when you read them, or when I read them, I think back to this guy. I think, yeah, I kind of remember that from here. Not that they ever copy it, but they're just... This definitely has had an influence. It's kind of echoed out. And it's just creepy, gothic, and strange. Very different than what we would consider fantasy now. But it is a classic in its own way. It's long. It's an investment. It's a bit slow. If you like the fast reads, I guess this isn't it. But well worth your time. So there's that. That is... number 4. Let's get to number 3. Number 3, we're going to go back in time now to something very different. We're going to go back to Lord Dunsany. I think it's pronounced Dunsany. It could be pronounced Dunsany. I'm not sure. I don't know that I've ever heard it pronounced. I've only read the name. I've never heard it. But Time and the Gods. This is completely different. It's not a novel. It's short stories. These originally came out in these thin little volumes, and it was written by Lord Dunsany, who was an actual English lord, or Scottish lord. Where were you from, Lord Dunsany? Yeah, born in London. In 1878, of an Anglo-Irish family that could trace its roots back to the 12th century. Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, 18th Baron Dunsany. Okay, there we go. His claim to fame were these books. They're beautiful. They've influenced an awful lot of people. Famously, they've actually influenced H.P. Lovecraft a lot. H.P. Lovecraft probably wouldn't be H.P. Lovecraft if he hadn't read Lord Dunsany. So if you want to go back to see his influences, surprisingly enough, this is a major one. All of these stories, this is the Fantasy Masterworks version, were published in many different little books of little stories where he created his own mythological world with gods and heroes and strange magical beings, and it's just beautifully written. I mean, it's just, as far as just a reading experience, it's just lovely, and completely different than something that you would probably read now. So it's a refreshing change If you want a refreshing change in fantasy, go back in time and pick up Lord Dunsany, because it's so worth it. He's so beautiful. He was influenced a lot. If you read it, you can see the influence of the King James Bible in here. So, obviously it's beautifully written. It's been published a little bit here and there in different books over time. This is a cool Ballantine adult fantasy version that was published by Lynn Carter, or edited by Lynn Carter back in the day. Probably the easiest way to get Lord Dunsany fiction now is through the Penguin Classics edition. This is easy to get. It has a bunch of his stories in it, and you will get a real taste, a real feel for this author who has had such tremendous influence. He influenced Lord of the Rings. He did. So now, the next two are obviously no surprise. So we're going to move right on to Conan. And I've got here the complete Chronicles of Conan by the great Robert E. Howard. This has influenced everything in fantasy. Robert E. Howard created modern sword and sorcery. And his most fantastic epic is, of course, the Conan stories. Some people prefer the Cole stories, but no, Conan was better. Conan is better than everything. Conan is a fascinating character. This volume is a great one to get. You can also get the Del Rey 3-volume set, which is another one that I would recommend you getting. These are presented in the order that they were written by Robert E. Howard, which, much like Elric, were not written in the order of the hero's life. They're all over the place. In fact, they start with a later adventure. The Phoenix on the Sword, I think, is the first story in this book, which was when Conan was already a king. And your first view of Conan is actually as he's sitting at his desk, drawing a map, where he's drawing the lands in the north where he was born and raised, which is not how you'd think a Conan story would start. But don't worry, a whole bunch of folks are getting killed by the end of that story, because it's Conan. Now, the great thing about Conan, besides the fantastic writing, which I'll get into in my Robert E. Howard video that's coming up next time, is the character of Conan himself. He travels across the Hyborian Age, a prehistoric world, and travels to different cities, having different adventures in different careers. He starts off as a thief. He becomes a mercenary. Eventually, he becomes a king of the greatest empire in this world. And he does it all on his own. So just a fascinating character, a great book. So what could number one be? What could it be? Boy, that's a tough one. I don't suppose it could be The Lord of the Rings. Yes, it could. Surprise, surprise. Now, of course, I've got... Where is it? I've got the extra fancy pants leather-bound version of Lord of the Rings in its case up here, along with the fancy pants leather-bound Hobbit. I'm not going to take those off the shelf because I got a couple other things to show you as far as the Hobbit, and I'm going to include the Hobbit in the Lord of the Rings because it is the prelude to the Lord of the Rings. I love the Hobbit. The Hobbit is how I got into fantasy. I first got into fantasy when I saw the Hobbit cartoon. There was a Hobbit cartoon that used to show up on television, and I'd watch it every time it showed up. And it had the little songs in it. The greatest adventure is what lies ahead. I mean, it was great for a kid anyway. And so, of course, I had to get the book, and the book was amazing. And you've read the book 100 times. I know you have. But you can always get the annotated Hobbit and read it in a whole new way. Tons of great background information in this about J.R.R. Tolkien and the invention of Middle-earth. It's just fascinating. The Hobbit's great. And of course, The Lord of the Rings was so hugely influential that nobody would publish anything that wasn't Lord of the Rings-like in fantasy for years and years. I mean, it was the ultimate fantasy quest with Frodo and Sam and Gandalf and they're taking the magic ring of Sauron and tossing it in to the Lake of Fire. You know the story. You've probably seen the movies. You've probably read the book a dozen times. What more could I have to say on the Lord of the Rings? It's great. I remember when I was reading the Lord of the Rings, how much darker it was than I expected it to be. There are a lot of real world things in Lord of the Rings. There are a lot of real world themes, mature themes in the Lord of the Rings, which if you're just going right from the Hobbit, it kind of takes you by surprise a little bit. The seduction of evil and all the just horrible monsters that inhabit Middle Earth, and it's just all the terrible things that happen to our heroes. It's, like I said, a lot darker than I expected. But just a gripping story, a gripping fantasy. There's a reason it's influenced everything. Even though I got the fancy pants, leather-bound version, those weren't the versions that I read. I read the paperback versions. And there's a bunch of different paperback versions that came out. I've got a few of them. Start off with the Fellowship of the Ring. This is my least favorite set. It had a set of illustrations that were kind of like this, with just kind of normal looking people standing around, not looking very adventurous. It not a great set of covers for this version. I like this version an awful lot. This is the Two Towers. This is the Two Tower version. This set, if you see the set that looks like this, beautiful, beautiful covers on these, and you can kind of see that. But this was a beautiful paperback set. Yeah, that was great. And this is the set that I actually read, and whenever I see a copy from this particular set, I get nostalgic. Now, this is the old-timey set. This is a copy of The Return of the King. It looks like it went on a journey through Middle-earth itself, probably at the bottom of Samwise's bag. It's pretty beat up, but this was the old 60s, 70s cover, and it's so cool. I mean, just look at that. That's great. I love it. I love The Lord of the Rings. Everybody loves The Lord of the Rings, and there's a reason. Hugely influential. That's my top 5 of fantasy. I hope you liked it. Come back to Stately Vaughan Manor next time so that you can see, finally, my Robert E. Howard video. I'm going to talk all about one of my very favorite authors, Robert E. Howard, and then right after that, I'm going to have another video about something I don't know about yet, but it's going to be horror themed. I know, it's time for another horror themed video, so that's what it's going to be, and I will catch you then. Bye, guys.